Today I come to the floor to address my colleagues about the bipartisan resolution of disapproval that I introduced on January 30th along with Senator Crapo and 24 other co-sponsors. This resolution now has 32 co-sponsors. And of course, this resolution of disapproval is absolutely necessary. The resolution is a procedure, as we know, under the Congressional Review Act for repealing executive branch regulations. The regulation at issue in this disapproval resolution was issued by the Social Security Administration under President Obama. This regulation unfairly stigmatizes people with disabilities. If the regulation is not repealed, it will allow the agency to very unfairly deprive Social Security recipients of their Second Amendment rights. The regulation would result in disability recipients being reported to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System as ineligible to own a firearm and thus have their Second Amendment rights violated. Now, this is essentially a national gun ban list. The agency accomplishes this by doing two things: determining if a person has a disorder on a vague quote-unquote mental disorder list, and two, appointing a representative payee to manage benefit payments. This process has been in place for years to merely assign a representative payee. That's merely someone to help a recipient with their finances who is authorized to deal with the bureaucracy on the behalf of that Social Security recipient. Now it is being used to report beneficiaries to a list so that they cannot buy or own a gun. And of course, once on that list, individuals are prohibited, as I've already inferred, from purchasing, owning, and possessing firearms, thus violating Second Amendment rights. The regulation is flawed beyond any kind of repair. It results in reporting people to the gun ban list that should not be on that list at all. It deprives those people for their constitutional rights, and in a very important way, violating their constitutional rights without even due process. Under current federal law, one must first be deemed, quote, mentally defective before being reported to the gun ban list. However, the mental disorder list in this regulation is filled with vague characteristics that do not fit into the federal, quote-unquote, mentally defective standard. The disorder list is inconsistent with the federal mentally defective standard. More importantly, the list was never designed to regulate firearms. As such, it is improper to use it for that purpose. Many of the disorders on the list are unrelated to gun safety. For example, the disorders list includes eating disorders, disorders that merely impact sleep or cause restlessness, and even disorders that could cause, quote-unquote, feelings of inadequacy. Because the Second Amendment is a fundamental right, the government must have a very compelling reason to regulate, and the regulation must be very narrowly tailored. It unfairly stigmatizes people then with disabilities. The government is essentially saying that a person with a disability, such as an eating disorder, is more likely to be violent and should no longer be allowed to own a gun. There is no evidence to support that general idea, and consequently people being denied constitutional rights without due process. And if a specific individual is likely to be violent due to the nature of their mental illness, then the government should have to prove it. Pretty basic constitutional law. The government should have to prove if you're denied a constitutional right. The National Council on Disabilities, and that happens to be a nonpartisan and independent federal agency, has said this, quote, "The rule stigmatizes a group of people who are not likely to perpetuate the kind of violence the rule hopes to address. Furthermore, it deprives a much broader class of individuals of a constitutional right that was intended by federal law," end of quote. In addition, the American Civil Liberties Union has said, and I quote, "We oppose this rule because it advances and reinforces the harmful stereotype that people with mental disabilities, a vast and diverse group of citizens, are violent. There is no data to support a connection between the need for a representative payee and a propensity towards gun violence," end of quote, by the American Civil Liberties Union. The Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities, and that's a coalition of 100 national disability groups, that consortium shares the same concerns about regulation, and I quote from them, "The current public dialogue is replete with inaccurate stereotyping of people with mental disabilities as violent and danger, and there is a real concern that the kind of policy change encompassed by this rule will reinforce those unfounded assumptions," end of quote. In other words, unfounded assumptions about who might be disabled or not. So, Mr. President, I ask that these letters be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Some of the supporters of the new gun ban have brought forth arguments to try and discredit the other side. They have said that repealing the agency rule will allow the mentally ill to acquire firearms. Let me tell you why that is not true. Under this regulation, the Social Security Administration never, ever determines a person to be mentally ill before reporting them to this gun ban list. It does not provide due process before reporting them to the list. Once the agency places a person on this disordered list, it then moves to assign a representative payee. But that is a very flawed process as well. The former Social Security Administration Inspector General said the following last year in testimony before a committee about assigning a representative payee. A very short quote from the Inspector General. "It is not a scientific decision. It is a personal opinion." End of quote. Now, It's quite obvious under our Constitution due process that the personal opinion of a bureaucrat cannot be the basis for taking away a person's Second Amendment rights. Further, a June 2015 internal Social Security report found significant shortcomings in the representative payee process, namely that, and I quote from the Social Security report, the Social Security Administration's capability determinations were undeveloped, undocumented, and insufficiently documented, end of quote. Now, very legitimate question can be raised. How can any of us be comfortable allowing our fellow citizens to be subjected to such a process that leads to the violation of constitutional rights? The regulation does not then require a formal hearing at any point. Federal law and other regulations require that a formal hearing take place. 18 U.S.C. 922, Pren D, Pren 4 requires adjudication before depriving someone of the right to own a firearm due to mental illness. There can be no adjudication if there is no hearing. And a 1996 ATF Federal Register notice says, quote, "The legislative history of the Gun Control Act makes it clear that a formal adjudication is necessary before firearms disabilities are incurred," end quote. The Obama administration knew that fundamental rights required constitutional due process. At the bare minimum, that requires a hearing. Yet, in this rule, no hearing is being afforded to that individual that will eventually have their constitutional rights abrogated. And of course, that ought to be considered not only a travesty, but a travesty on the Constitution as well. The constitutional due process is entirely non-existent because there is absolutely no opportunity for an individual to challenge the proceedings against them. The American Civil Liberties Union has echoed the same concerns, and I quote from the ACLU, "The rule includes no meaningful due process protections prior to the Social Security Administration's transmittal of the names to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System database," end of quote from the ACLU. The Second Amendment is very much being tossed aside without a formal dispute process to challenge the actions before a constitutional right is abridged. On these facts alone, the regulation should be repealed, but there's yet more. The regulation fails to establish that a person is a danger to themselves or a danger to others before taking away the constitutional rights that the Second Amendment allows. If a rule premised on safety is to have any credibility, one would obviously think that the government needs to prove a person is dangerous. But this rule fails in that regard because it does not require the agency to find a person is in fact dangerous. The Second Amendment is a fundamental right requiring the government to carry the burden showing a person has a dangerous mental illness. This regulation obviously and simply does not achieve that requirement. To be clear, however, if this regulation is repealed, federal gun prohibitions will still exist. Individuals who have been determined to be a danger to themselves or a danger to others will still be prohibited from purchasing firearms. Also, individuals who are found to have a dangerous mental illness will be prohibited from purchasing a firearm. Also, a person convicted of a felony or a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence will still be prohibited from purchasing and owning and possessing a firearm. The same for those involuntarily committed to a mental institution. So, Mr. President, as government expands, liberty contracts. And it follows that with the expansion of government, power is centralized here in this island surrounded by reality that we call Washington, D.C., rather than throughout the American people. And often with that centralization of power, the centralization of power that you see in this regulation by the Social Security Administration, fairness does not necessarily follow. This Obama-era regulation is a perfect example of government wielding too much power. The power to deny people due process, the power to deny people their constitutional rights under the Second Amendment. The process I described here is extremely problematic, and it calls for doing away with this rule by passing this resolution of disapproval. It is not clear that any of these disorders a person is labeled with has anything whatsoever to do with a person's ability to responsibly own a firearm. And there is insufficient due process to ensure that a person actually has a given disorder that would interfere with their safe use of a firearm. Notably, even a representative payee has been assigned. Notably, even if a representative payee has been assigned, the individual still maintains the capacity to contract. Thus, the government is subject to a very low threshold to report names to the gun list and no burden of proof being necessary. By contrast, under this regulation, those who are reported to the list must prove the negative. They got to prove that the government's wrong. They must prove, in a sense of proving the government's wrong, they must prove that they are not a danger in order to get their name off of that gun ban list. For the government to shift the burden to the citizens whose rights it is depriving is clearly unfair. It's not only unfair, it's unconstitutional. The failure to determine a person mentally ill or that person being a danger to self or to others is a material defect to this regulation, and so is the failure to afford constitutional due process. There is no reasonable basis under this regulation to justify abridging that very important fundamental constitutional right. And that is why this regulation must be repealed through the passage of this resolution of disapproval. I yield the floor.